In the span of a single human lifetime, the world would be reinvented. Where horses once pulled wooden carts along muddy roads, iron locomotives now thundered across continents. Where candlelight had once defined human productivity, now gas lamps and emerging electrical systems would illuminate entire cities. Between 1837 and 1901, during Queen Victoria's remarkable reign, humanity would experience a transformation more profound and rapid than in any previous century, a period where machines would not just change how people worked, but fundamentally redesign human potential. This was an era that would birth the modern world, turning traditional societies upside down and setting the stage for the explosive technological and social revolutions of the 20th century. The Victorian age was not merely a historical period. It was a crucible in which our contemporary world was forged. The story of the Victorian Industrial Revolution begins long before the first steam engines whistle-echoed through British factories. It emerged from a complex tapestry of intellectual curiosity, technological innovation, and social upheaval that had been quietly brewing throughout the 18th century. The agricultural revolution had already transformed rural landscapes, creating surplus labor and generating capital that would fuel industrial expansion. Innovations in farming, such as crop rotation, selective breeding, and more efficient land management, had increased agricultural productivity, setting the stage for profound economic metamorphosis. England's unique geographical and social conditions made it the perfect crucible for industrial innovation. Unlike many European nations fragmented by political boundaries, Britain possessed a relatively unified legal and economic system. The enclosure movements had consolidated agricultural lands, creating larger, more efficient farms and displacing rural populations. These displaced workers would become the primary workforce for the emerging industrial economy, creating a vast pool of labor desperate for employment. Steam power represented the beating heart of industrial transformation. James Watt's revolutionary steam engine, developed in 1769, was not merely a mechanical invention, but a fundamental reimagining of human productive capacity. Where previous steam engines converted only a fraction of thermal energy into mechanical work, Watt's design achieved unprecedented efficiency. His separate condenser allowed steam to be repeatedly used, dramatically reducing fuel consumption and increasing power output. The textile industry became the first and most dramatic showcase of industrial potential. Before mechanization, textile production was a cottage industry. Families would spin cotton and wool using simple hand tools. Richard Arkwright's water frame in 1769 and Samuel Crompton's spinning mule in 1779 transformed this landscape entirely. These machines could produce textiles at rates that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. A single machine could do the work of dozens of skilled artisans, precipitating a fundamental shift in labor dynamics. Textile mills emerged as the cathedrals of this new industrial age. In Manchester and Birmingham, massive brick structures rose, their tall chimneys becoming symbols of technological progress. Inside these mills, rows of machines operated with mechanical precision, turning raw cotton into finished cloth at unprecedented speeds. The power loom, invented by Edmund Cartwright in 1785, could weave fabric faster and more consistently than any human craftsman. The railway system represented perhaps the most visible and transformative technological innovation of the era. Before railways, transportation was slow, expensive, and unreliable. Horse-drawn coaches might travel 10 to 15 miles per day, with journeys between major cities taking days or even weeks. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway, opened in 1830, changed everything. Trains could now cover 30 miles in an hour, a speed that seemed almost miraculous to contemporary observers. George Stephenson, often called the father of railways, played a crucial role in this transformation. His locomotive, the Rocket, won the legendary Rainhill Trials in 1829, proving that steam-powered transportation was not just possible but economically viable. By 1850, Britain had over 6,000 miles of railway track. These railways did more than transport goods. They transformed social interactions, economic structures, and human perceptions of time and space. The Industrial Transformation fundamentally reshaped economic relationships. Traditional guild systems and artisan production gave way to factory-based manufacturing. Skilled craftsmen who had previously controlled their production process found themselves becoming wage laborers, component parts in massive industrial machines. This economic shift created new social classes. Industrial capitalists, factory owners and investors, accumulated unprecedented wealth. The middle class expanded, with managers, engineers, and administrators becoming crucial to the new economic order. Simultaneously, the working class grew exponentially, concentrated in rapidly expanding urban centers. Cities transformed from modest population centers to massive, complex ecosystems. Manchester's population exploded from 75,000 in 1801 to 303,000 by 1851. Birmingham grew from 73,000 to 232,000 in the same period. These were not mere numerical increases but fundamental reimaginings of human settlement. Housing for industrial workers was often cramped, unsanitary, and overcrowded. Multiple families might share single rooms in densely packed neighborhoods. These living conditions became breeding ground for diseases like cholera and typhoid, presenting significant public health challenges that would drive future social reforms. The Industrial Revolution was not without profound environmental consequences. Coal became the primary energy source, leading to unprecedented levels of atmospheric pollution. Cities were often shrouded in thick, black smoke from countless factory chimneys. Rivers became repositories of industrial waste, their waters turning dark and toxic. Child labor emerged as a particularly troubling aspect of industrial expansion. Children as young as 6 worked in mines and factories, performing dangerous tasks for minimal wages. Their small size made them ideal for tasks like cleaning machinery or working in tight spaces in coal mines. It would take decades of social activism to establish meaningful protections for child workers. While the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, its impact was global. American industrialists like Andrew Carnegie studied British manufacturing techniques, rapidly implementing similar systems in steel production. European nations like France and Germany accelerated their own industrial development, creating competitive manufacturing ecosystems. The revolution was not merely technological but geopolitical. Industrial capacity became a measure of national power, driving imperial expansions and global economic competitions. Britain's industrial superiority would underpin its global empire, providing technological and economic advantages that would shape international relations for decades. Beyond machines and economics, the Industrial Revolution represented a profound philosophical shift. Traditional agrarian worldviews gave way to more mechanistic perspectives. Time became commodified, with factory whistles replacing natural rhythms of sunrise and sunset. The concept of labor transformed from a craft-based activity to a standardized, measurable commodity. Writers and artists began exploring these transformations. Charles Dickens' novels like Hard Times and Oliver Twist offered powerful critiques of industrial society, highlighting its human costs. The Pre-Raphaelite artists would later rebel against industrial monotony, championing beauty and emotional depth as counterpoints to mechanical efficiency. The Victorian Industrial Revolution was more than a technological phase. It was a comprehensive reconstruction of human society. In less than a century, economic structures, social relationships, and human expectations were fundamentally reimagined. The modest steam engines and early factories would evolve into complex systems that would define not just the 19th century, but lay the groundwork for the entire modern world. As the 19th century progressed, the initial promise and peril of industrialization became increasingly clear. It was a period of unprecedented human potential, marked by brilliant innovation and profound social challenges, a testament to humanity's capacity for both remarkable progress and systemic complexity. The Victorian era emerged as a profound moment of social awakening, where the fundamental structures of human society found themselves challenged, questioned, and gradually reshaped. This was not a peaceful transition, but a complex battlefield of competing interests, where workers, women, children, and marginalized communities fought relentlessly to transform the brutal realities of their existence. Social reform was not a gift bestowed from above, but a hard-won victory carved through decades of persistent struggle, intellectual debate, and moral conviction. The industrial transformation had created a social landscape of unprecedented complexity and inequality. Cities like Manchester and London became living embodiments of this contradiction, magnificent centers of global power existing alongside some of the most desperate human living conditions ever documented in modern history. Massive textile mills and gleaming industrial complexes stood in stark contrast to cramped, disease-ridden slums where entire families might inhabit a single, windowless room. Perhaps no aspect of Victorian social reform represents the era's moral transformation more powerfully than the campaign against child labor. In the early decades of the 19th century, children as young as 5 or 6 were routinely employed in mines, factories, and workshops, working punishing 12 to 14-hour shifts in conditions that will be considered unimaginably cruel by modern standards. The Mines and Collieries Act of 1842 marked a critical turning point. This groundbreaking legislation prohibited underground work for women and girls and banned boys under 10 from working in mines. It represented more than a legal document. It was a profound moral statement about childhood, human dignity, and societal responsibility. Reformers like Lord Shaftesbury became pivotal figures in this transformation. His passionate advocacy for child welfare led to multiple legislative victories, including the Factory Act of 1833, which limited working hours for children and mandated minimal educational requirements. These were not mere administrative changes, but fundamental reimaginings of childhood itself, transforming children from economic assets to human beings deserving protection and education. Education emerged as a critical battleground for social transformation. Before the Victorian reforms, education was a privilege reserved for the wealthy, with most working-class children receiving little to no formal schooling. The Elementary Education Act of 1817, championed by reformers like William Foster, represented a revolutionary concept that education was not a luxury but a fundamental right. This legislation established school boards with the power to build and manage schools in areas where insufficient educational infrastructure existed. For the first time, a systematic approach to universal education took shape. By 1880, school attendance was made compulsory for children aged 5 to 10, a radical concept that would fundamentally reshape social mobility and individual opportunity. The labor movement represented another critical dimension of social reform. Trade unions, initially viewed as radical and dangerous by the establishment, gradually became recognized as legitimate vehicles for worker protection. The Trade Union Act of 1871 represented a crucial legal milestone, providing trade unions with legal status and protecting workers' rights to organize. Figures like Tom Mann and George Howell emerged as crucial leaders, articulating workers' demands for fair wages, reasonable working hours, and safer working conditions. These were not merely economic demands, but profound statements about human dignity and the fundamental rights of workers in an increasingly mechanized world. The Victorian women's rights movement represented one of the most significant social transformations of the era. Women like Barbara Bodichon and Millicent Fawcett challenged deeply entrenched legal and social structures that systematically marginalized women. The Married Women's Property Act of 1882 marked a revolutionary moment. Before this legislation, women lost all property rights upon marriage, with their possessions legally transferring to their husbands. The act allowed married women to own, purchase, and sell property independently, a fundamental challenge to patriarchal economic structures. While full voting rights would not be achieved until the early 20th century, the Victorian era laid crucial groundwork. Women's colleges were established, professional opportunities slowly expanded, and intellectual discourse began challenging traditional notions of female capability and social role. The public health movement represented another critical arena of social reform. Cities like London and Manchester were death traps, with inadequate sanitation creating breeding grounds for cholera, typhoid, and other devastating diseases. Edwin Chadwick's groundbreaking report on sanitary conditions in 1842 exposed the brutal living conditions of the urban poor. The Public Health Act of 1848 established a framework for urban sanitation, creating local board of health and providing mechanisms for improving water supply, sewage systems, and overall urban infrastructure. These were not merely administrative changes, but fundamental interventions that would dramatically increase urban survival rates. The Victorian era marked a pivotal shift in how society understood and treated mental illness. Before this period, those with mental health conditions were often treated as criminals or moral failures rather than as people suffering from legitimate medical conditions. The treatment was typically harsh and punitive. The Lunacy Acts of 1845 and 1890 represented significant legal milestones that began to change this approach. The 1845 Lunacy Act established the Lunacy Commission, which was the first national regulatory body specifically tasked with inspecting asylums and protecting patients from abuse. This act required that all counties in England and Wales build public asylums, moving mental health care from private to public oversight. Dr. John Connolly was a particularly influential figure in this transformation. As the superintendent of the Hanwell Asylum in Middlesex from 1839, he pioneered what was called the non-restraint movement. Connolly famously abolished the use of mechanical restraints such as chains, straitjackets, and manacles that had been standard practice in asylums. Instead, he advocated for more humane approaches, including providing meaningful activities and occupations for patients, creating more pleasant and spacious environments, training staff in how to manage patients without physical coercion, and implementing a more individualized approach to understanding mental illness. The 1890 Lunacy Act further strengthened protections for patients by requiring more rigorous certification procedures before someone could be committed to an asylum. It also enhanced the legal rights of those diagnosed with mental illness. These reforms reflected a deeper philosophical shift in understanding mental health, a growing recognition that mental illnesses were medical conditions requiring treatment rather than moral failings deserving punishment. This period saw the early development of psychiatry as a legitimate medical specialty. However, it's important to note that while these were significant improvements, Victorian mental health care still had serious limitations by modern standards. Many asylums became overcrowded, treatments remained experimental and sometimes harmful, and certain conditions were still highly stigmatized. The full medicalization of mental health treatment would continue to evolve well beyond the Victorian period. The social reforms of the Victorian era were not isolated events, but part of a comprehensive reimagining of human potential. Each legislative victory, each social movement represented a challenge to existing power structures, a statement that society could be more just, more compassionate, more inclusive. These reforms did not emerge from a vacuum, but through the persistent, often thankless work of activists, intellectuals, workers, and ordinary citizens who believed in the possibility of meaningful social change. They understood that progress was not a gift but a constant, challenging negotiation, a truth that continues to resonate in our contemporary world. The Victorian social reform movement demonstrated a fundamental human capacity, the ability to look unflinchingly at social injustice and commit to transformative change. One legal reform, one educational opportunity, one worker's right at a time. By the height of Queen Victoria's reign, a remarkable transformation had occurred. A small island nation off the northwestern coast of Europe had become the most extensive empire in human history, controlling nearly a quarter of the world's land surface and governing approximately 458 million people. This was not merely a political achievement, but a complex global phenomenon that would reshape human civilization in ways that would reverberate for centuries. The British Empire was never a uniform, monolithic entity. It was an intricate mosaic of territories acquired through diverse means: conquest, treaty, trade, and strategic occupation. From the frozen landscapes of Canada to the tropical forests of India, from the deserts of Africa to the distant islands of the Pacific, British influence stretched across continents, creating an unprecedented network of economic, cultural, and administrative connections. Economic motivations drove imperial expansion far more complexly than simple narratives of exploitation might suggest. The East India Company, originally a trading enterprise, had transformed into a quasi-governmental organization that effectively governed vast territories. By 1858, it controlled nearly the entire Indian subcontinent, not through military conquest alone, but through sophisticated networks of local collaboration, economic integration, and strategic diplomacy. Trade routes became the circulatory system of the empire. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, dramatically shortened maritime routes between Britain and its eastern territories. What once took months of dangerous sea travel could now be accomplished in weeks. This technological marvel was more than an engineering achievement. It was a strategic infrastructure that would reshape global commerce and imperial power dynamics. Contrary to simplistic narratives of one-directional cultural imposition, the British Empire represented profound two-way cultural exchange. Indian textiles influenced British fashion, while British administrative and educational systems were adapted and transformed by local populations. Languages merged, culinary traditions intermingled, and complex hybrid cultural forms emerged. In India, the introduction of English language education created a new class of indigenous intellectuals who would later become crucial leaders in independence movements. Institutions like the Calcutta Medical College, established in 1835, trained local physicians using both Western and traditional medical knowledge, representing a nuanced approach to cultural interaction. The British developed sophisticated administrative systems that would influence governance models worldwide. The Indian civil service, for instance, created a meritocratic bureaucratic model that was revolutionary for its time. Recruitment was increasingly based on competitive examinations, challenging traditional aristocratic appointment systems. These administrative innovations were not purely benevolent. They were strategic mechanisms for maintaining imperial control, creating local administrative classes loyal to British interests while simultaneously providing opportunities for social mobility within colonial frameworks. Imperial territories witnessed unprecedented infrastructural transformations. In India, the railway system built by the British covered over 40,000 kilometers by 1900, connecting previously isolated regions. These were not merely transportation networks, but complex systems of economic integration and administrative control. telegraph lines crisscrossed continents, creating the first global communication networks. The first transatlantic telegraph cable in 1866 allowed near-instantaneous communication between London and its distant territories, fundamentally altering concepts of time, distance, and administrative coordination. The narrative of imperial control across global territories was characterized by constant negotiation, adaptation, and resistance that often undermined colonial powers' claims of seamless authority. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 represents a watershed moment in imperial history, revealing the fragility of colonial control despite technological advantages. When sepoys, Indian soldiers, in the British East India Company's army revolted against cultural and religious impositions, what began as a military mutiny rapidly evolved into a widespread civilian uprising with deep socio-political dimensions. This rebellion forced Britain to fundamentally reconsider its entire approach to governing India. The aftermath of 1857 produced profound structural changes, with the British Crown assuming direct control of Indian territories from the East India Company. This shift represented not merely an administrative reorganization, but a recognition that colonial rule required more sophisticated governance mechanisms. The British implemented policies of selective accommodation toward Indian elites and princes while simultaneously introducing more substantial military presence and intelligence networks, revealing the paradoxical nature of imperial rule that combined coercion with collaborative governance. In African territories, imperial powers encountered equally complex forms of resistance that challenged European assumptions of cultural and military superiority. The Battle of Isandlwana in 1879 during the Anglo-Zulu War stands as a remarkable example where Zulu forces under King Sethweo's leadership implemented sophisticated military strategies to overwhelm British troops. This victory demonstrated the tactical brilliance of indigenous military leadership and the effectiveness of African warfare methods when properly mobilized against European invasion forces. Beyond these dramatic confrontations, everyday forms of resistance permeated colonial societies. Indigenous peoples developed numerous strategies to preserve cultural autonomy while navigating imperial systems, from passive non-compliance and strategic adaptation to colonial institutions to the maintenance of parallel governance structures beneath the veneer of colonial control. Local populations often subverted colonial educational systems, religious institutions, and economic structures to serve their own communities' interests rather than imperial agendas. The complex interplay between resistance and accommodation created colonial societies that functioned quite differently from imperial metropoles' idealized visions. Colonial subjects frequently appropriated and transformed imperial ideologies like civilization and progress to challenge the very foundations of imperial rule. The anti-colonial movements that eventually emerged in the 20th century built upon these traditions of resistance while incorporating new political languages and organizational forms suitable for challenging imperial powers on both local and international stages. Imperial expansion was not just about territorial control, but about human movement. Millions of British citizens migrated to colonial territories, while simultaneously, population from colonies moved across the empire. This created complex, multi-layered societies that defied simple categorization. The indentured labor system, which brought workers from India to work in Caribbean plantations, represented a particularly complex form of human migration. These workers, often recruited under challenging circumstances, would create vibrant diasporic communities that would profoundly influence global cultural landscapes. While imperial narratives often focus on economic extraction, the reality was more nuanced. In some territories, British investments developed local industries, introduced new agricultural techniques, and created economic infrastructures that would persist beyond colonial rule. In India, for instance, the textile industry underwent fundamental transformations. While British policies often protected metropolitan manufacturing interests, they simultaneously created conditions for local industrial development that would become crucial in the post-colonial era. The concept of a civilizing mission played a crucial role in imperial ideology. British administrators and politicians often presented imperial expansion as a moral enterprise, bringing civilization, education, and progressive values to backward societies. This ideology was profoundly complex. It represented simultaneously a genuine belief in progressive values and a sophisticated mechanism of cultural and economic domination. Missionaries, educators, and administrators genuinely believed they were improving societies, even as their actions fundamentally disrupted existing social and cultural structures. The British Empire was never a simple narrative of conquest or liberation. It was a complex global system that transformed human societies in ways that continue to reverberate. Its legacy is not a clear-cut story of good or evil, but a profound, multifaceted historical phenomenon that reshaped global power structures, cultural interactions, and human understanding. As the 19th century drew to a close, the British Empire stood at its zenith, a global network more extensive and intricate than any previous human civilization. Yet, within its very structures lay the seeds of its eventual transformation and dissolution, a testament to the dynamic, ever-changing nature of human social organization. In the grand narrative of human intellectual achievement, the Victorian era stands as a watershed moment, a period when scientific inquiry transformed from a pursuit of privileged scholars to a fundamental approach to understanding the world. This was not merely a time of technological innovation, but an era of profound philosophical and intellectual revolution that would fundamentally reshape human understanding of nature, humanity, and our place in the universe. The scientific landscape of the Victorian period was characterized by an unprecedented spirit of exploration and discovery. Unlike previous eras, where scientific knowledge was fragmented and often constrained by religious or philosophical dogma, this period witnessed a systematic, methodical approach to understanding the natural world. Scientists were no longer simply observers or collectors of curiosities, but active investigators committed to developing rigorous methodologies for testing and verifying knowledge. The infrastructure of scientific research underwent a dramatic transformation during this period. The British Association for the Advancement of Science, founded in 1831, created formal networks for scientific communication and collaboration. Scientific societies proliferated, providing platforms for researchers to share findings, debate theories, and collectively advance human knowledge. Museums and research institutions became crucibles of scientific innovation. The British Museum, founded in 1753, expanded its collections and research capabilities, becoming a global center for scientific and anthropological study. The Royal Society, which had existed since the 17th century, entered a new phase of dynamic intellectual engagement, supporting and publishing groundbreaking research across multiple disciplines. No single scientific development epitomizes the Victorian scientific spirit more profoundly than Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. Published in On the Origin of Species in 1859, Darwin's work represented far more than a biological theory. It was a comprehensive philosophical challenge to existing understandings of life, creation, and human nature. Darwin's work emerged from decades of meticulous observation and research. His voyage on the HMS Beagle between 1831 and 1836 had provided him with extensive biological and geological data from around the world. By carefully documenting variations in species across different environments, Darwin developed a revolutionary understanding of how organisms adapt and change over time. The theory of natural selection proposed that organisms best adapted to their environment would survive and reproduce, gradually transforming species over generations. This was a radical departure from previous understandings that viewed species as fixed, unchanging entities created in their final form. The Victorian era witnessed remarkable medical innovations that would fundamentally transform human healthcare. Joseph Lister's development of antiseptic surgical techniques in the 1860s represents a pivotal moment in medical history. By introducing carbolic acid to clean surgical instruments and wounds, Lister dramatically reduced post-surgical infection rates, making complex surgical procedures increasingly viable. The germ theory of disease, developed by researchers like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, represented another revolutionary scientific breakthrough. This understanding that diseases were caused by microscopic organisms rather than by mysterious miasmas or spiritual afflictions transformed medical practice and public health strategies. This period also saw remarkable advances in physics and our understanding of energy. James Clerk Maxwell's work on electromagnetic theory, culminating in his comprehensive equations in 1865, unified electricity, magnetism, and light as interconnected phenomena. These equations would later provide the theoretical foundation for Einstein's work on relativity. Michael Faraday's experiments with electricity and magnetism laid crucial groundwork for modern electrical technologies. His discovery of electromagnetic induction, the principle behind electric generators, would revolutionize industrial and technological development. Geological research during this period fundamentally challenged existing understanding of Earth's history. Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, published between 1830 and 1833, introduced a concept of uniformitarianism, the idea that geological processes observable today have operated similarly throughout Earth's history. This challenged previous beliefs about sudden, catastrophic geological transformations and provided a framework for understanding geological time on an unprecedented scale. Astronomical observations also expanded dramatically. The development of more powerful telescopes and more sophisticated mathematical models allowed scientists to develop more comprehensive understanding of celestial mechanics and planetary systems. Dmitri Mendeleev's development of the periodic table in 1869 represented a pivotal moment in chemical understanding that fundamentally transformed how scientists conceptualize matter. The brilliance of Mendeleev's approach lay not merely in organizing existing knowledge, but in creating a system with remarkable predictive power. By arranging elements based on their atomic weights and chemical properties, Mendeleev identified patterns that revealed the underlying structure of matter itself. When Mendeleev first presented his arrangement, several gaps appeared in his table. Rather than viewing these as flaws, he boldly predicted the existence of yet undiscovered elements and even described their expected properties with remarkable precision. The subsequent discoveries of gallium 1875, scandium 1879, and germanium 1886 validated Mendeleev's predictions and elevated the periodic table from clever classification to profound theoretical framework. Each discovery strengthened the periodic law and demonstrated the underlying order within the apparent chaos of chemical elements. The periodic table represented more than a practical tool. It embodied the Victorian scientific ethos of finding rational order in nature. Its development occurred within a broader intellectual context where scientists increasingly sought to identify fundamental laws governing natural phenomena. The table's ability to organize disparate elements into coherent groups suggested that nature followed comprehensible patterns awaiting human discovery through methodical investigation. Victorian scientific advances rapidly transformed from theoretical insights to practical technologies, creating an unprecedented acceleration in material progress. The scientific principles underlying thermodynamics found immediate application in steam engine optimization, dramatically increasing efficiency and transforming transportation and manufacturing. James Joule's experiments establishing the mechanical equivalent of heat and Lord Kelvin's theoretical work on energy conversion directly informed engineering improvements that increase industrial productivity. Chemical research similarly revolutionized industrial processes. The development of synthetic dyes beginning with William Perkin's accidental discovery of Movane in 1856 created entirely new industries. These chemical innovations transformed textile production while establishing new relationships between academic research and industrial application. German chemical companies particularly excelled at institutionalizing this relationship, establishing industrial laboratories where scientific research directly fed manufacturing innovation. Medical science experienced similar transformations as laboratory discoveries reached clinical practice. Joseph Lister's antiseptic techniques, informed by Louis Pasteur's germ theory, revolutionized surgical outcomes. The methodical application of scientific principles to medical practice dramatically reduced mortality rates from surgical procedures and childbirth, representing one of the most immediate humanitarian benefits of Victorian scientific progress. Scientific advancement during the Victorian era proceeded against significant resistance from established institutions and entrenched worldviews. Darwin's evolutionary theory generated particularly intense controversy as it challenged literal interpretations of biblical creation accounts. Religious leaders frequently condemned evolution as materialistic and morally dangerous, fearing its implications for human uniqueness and divine purpose. The famous Oxford debate between Thomas Huxley and Bishop Samuel Wilberforce in 1860 symbolized this clash between scientific naturalism and religious tradition. Scientific controversies extended beyond religion-science tensions to debates within scientific communities themselves. Geologists disputed the Earth's age, with some following Lord Kelvin's calculations suggesting a relatively young planet, 20 to 40 million years, while others insisted geological processes required much longer time frames. These internal disagreements revealed science as a dynamic, contested process rather than a monolithic authority. Women seeking scientific education and recognition encountered systematic barriers despite their contributions. Figures like Mary Anning, whose fossil discoveries informed early paleontology, often received inadequate credit for their work. The gradual establishment of women's colleges at Cambridge and Oxford represented halting progress toward educational access, though professional opportunities remained severely limited until well into the 20th century. Victorian scientific institutions themselves often struggled between democratizing knowledge and maintaining professional authority. Public lectures, museum exhibitions, and popular science publications increased scientific literacy among middle-class Victorians, yet professional scientists simultaneously worked to establish credentials and expertise that distinguished them from amateur enthusiasts. This tension between accessibility and professionalization created ongoing debates about who could legitimately participate in scientific discourse. The scientific progress of the Victorian era represented more than a series of discoveries. It was a comprehensive reimagining of human intellectual potential. By developing rigorous methodologies, creating institutional support for research, and maintaining a spirit of fearless inquiry, Victorian scientists laid the groundwork for modern scientific understanding. As the 19th century drew to a close, the world looked fundamentally different. Where once nature had been viewed through lenses of mysticism and limited observation, now it was understood as a complex, interconnected system governed by discoverable laws. The Victorian scientific revolution was not just about collecting facts, but about developing a new way of thinking, a legacy that continues to shape human understanding to this day. The Victorian era stands as one of the most profound periods of human transformation in modern history, a crucible of change that reshaped virtually every aspect of human experience. More than a mere historical period, it represented a comprehensive reimagining of human potential, challenging and reconstructing social, technological, intellectual, and cultural foundations that have remained largely unchanged for centuries. What makes the Victorian period so extraordinary was not just the scale of its transformations, but their interconnected nature. Social reforms, scientific discoveries, industrial innovations, cultural expressions, and imperial ambitions were not isolated phenomena, but deeply intertwined processes of human reimagination. Each breakthrough in one domain, be it technological, social, or intellectual, created ripple effects that would fundamentally alter human understanding and experience. The era epitomized a profound dialectical relationship between extraordinary human achievement and systemic human suffering. The same industrial mechanisms that generated unprecedented technological innovations also created brutal working conditions. The scientific discoveries that expanded human knowledge simultaneously provided intellectual frameworks that often justified social inequalities. The cultural flourishing that produced remarkable artistic expressions existed alongside extreme social stratification. This complexity challenges simplistic narratives of linear progress. The Victorian period was not a story of unambiguous advancement, but a nuanced landscape of simultaneous liberation and constraint, a remarkable human creativity existing alongside profound human limitations. The technological transformations of the Victorian era fundamentally redefined human capabilities. The steam engine, railways, and early telecommunications did more than change industrial production. They reimagined human relationships with time, space, and possibility. Distance became malleable, communication transcended previous limitations, and human productive capacity expanded exponentially. Scientific methodologies developed during this period represented an equally profound transformation. The systematic, evidence-based approach to understanding the world, exemplified by Darwin's evolutionary theory or Maxwell's electromagnetic equations, created new ways of conceptualizing human knowledge. Science became not just a method of observation, but a fundamental philosophical approach to understanding reality. The social reforms of the Victorian period demonstrated humanity's capacity for collective moral evolution. The struggles for workers' rights, children's protection, women's opportunities, and expanded educational access were not mere legal modifications but profound statements about human dignity. These movements revealed society's ability to critically examine its own structures and imagine more inclusive, compassionate social arrangements. The expansion of educational opportunities, in particular, represented a revolutionary concept. Education was transformed from a privilege to a potential universal right, creating unprecedented social mobility and individual empowerment. The Victorian era witnessed the creation of new mechanisms for social reform that fundamentally changed how societies address human suffering and injustice. Prior to this period, social improvement largely depended on individual charity or localized religious initiatives. Victorian reformers systematically developed institutional frameworks, parliamentary commissions, statistical societies, investigative journalism, and advocacy organizations that transformed social reform from sporadic benevolence to sustained, evidence-based campaigns for structural change. These institutional innovations created durable pathways for identifying social problems, building public awareness, and implementing systemic solutions. The statistical movement, pioneered by figures like William Farr and Florence Nightingale, revolutionized reform efforts by introducing quantitative analysis of social conditions. Their meticulous documentation of mortality rates, disease patterns, and living conditions transformed vague impressions of suffering into precise measurements that demanded response. Nightingale's innovative visual representations of preventable military hospital deaths dramatically illustrated how proper sanitation could save lives, making abstract statistics emotionally compelling for public audiences. This marriage of empirical rigor with moral advocacy created a powerful new approach to social reform that continues influencing contemporary public health initiatives. Parliamentary investigations like the Children's Employment Commission of 1842 similarly transformed reform discourse by systematically documenting working conditions through direct testimony and observation. The resulting reports describing children as young as 4 working in mines and factories shocked public conscience and provided irrefutable evidence for legislative intervention. These investigations established an important precedent that governance required detailed understanding of social realities, particularly regarding society's most vulnerable members. This investigative approach to governance represented a profound shift from earlier periods when ruling classes remained largely isolated from the lived experiences of ordinary citizens. The Victorian reform movement, from Chartism to anti-slavery campaigns to women's suffrage, catalyzed democratic participation across unprecedented social breadth. These movements created political apprenticeships where ordinary citizens developed organizational skills, rhetorical capabilities, and strategic thinking previously confined to traditional elites. Through petition campaigns, public meetings, pamphlet distribution, and direct lobbying, these movements transformed political participation from periodic voting for the limited franchise to continuous civic engagement. This expansion of political agency gradually reshaped British society from a deferential hierarchy toward a more participatory civic culture. Temperance societies particularly exemplified this democratizing potential, especially in working-class communities where alcohol consumption often exacerbated economic vulnerability. While sometimes dismissed as merely moralistic, these organizations provided crucial spaces where working-class men and women could develop leadership skills, organizational experience, and public speaking abilities. Local temperance halls frequently hosted educational lectures, reading groups, and cultural performances that expanded intellectual horizons beyond immediate daily concerns. For many working-class individuals, these organizations provided their first experience of democratic participation and collective agency, experiences that frequently translated into broader political engagement. Religious nonconformity similarly created alternative social spaces where traditional hierarchies could be challenged. Methodism, with its emphasis on individual spiritual worth regardless of social station, provided theological frameworks that implicitly questioned rigid class distinctions. The promotion of lay preachers from working-class backgrounds created unprecedented opportunities for self-expression and community leadership. When primitive Methodist chapels welcomed women preachers, they created rare public platforms for female voices in an era of severe gender constraints. These religious communities thus functioned as crucibles where more egalitarian social relationships could be experienced and practiced, even as their formal theologies often remained conservative on many issues. Victorian reform movements gradually expanded the conceptual boundaries of moral concern beyond traditional limitations of class, gender, religion, and even species. The anti-slavery movement, building on earlier abolitionist successes, maintained attention on human bondage throughout the empire even after domestic abolition. Organizations like the British and Foreign Anti-Slavery Society, founded 1839, sustained moral pressure against slavery globally, challenging imperial policies that tacitly supported bonded labor in colonial territories. These efforts represented important, if limited, challenges to racialized hierarchies that justified imperial domination. The emergence of animal protection movements similarly demonstrated expanding conceptions of moral responsibility beyond human communities. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, founded 1824, campaigned against animal baiting, vivisection, and working animal abuse. While these concerns partly reflected middle-class distaste for working-class entertainments, they nevertheless establish important precedents regarding humanity's ethical obligations toward non-human creatures. The philosophical implications were profound. Moral consideration extended beyond species boundaries, suggesting an expanding circle of ethical concern that would eventually inform environmental movements and animal rights advocacy. Public health campaigns reconceptualized disease prevention as collective responsibility rather than individual misfortune. Reformers like Edwin Chadwick argued that sanitation infrastructure, sewage systems, clean water supplies, housing regulations represented essential social investments rather than optional amenities. This framework challenged laissez-faire approaches to urban development, asserting that the state had legitimate responsibility for ensuring environmental conditions compatible with human health. These movements establish important conceptual foundations for public health systems that would become fundamental to modern governance. The Victorian transformation of education went beyond merely expanding access to existing knowledge systems. It fundamentally reimagined learning's purpose and potential. Early Victorian education emphasized rigid hierarchies, rote memorization, and moral discipline, reflecting industrial needs of compliant workers and social desires for maintaining class boundaries. However, reform movements gradually challenged these limited conceptions, advocating education as a vehicle for individual development and social transformation rather than merely social reproduction. Working men's colleges, established in industrial cities beginning with F.D. Maurice's London Institution in 1854, embodied this transformative vision. Unlike merely vocational training, these institutions offered comprehensive humanities curricula previously available only to elites. When figures like John Ruskin and Dante Gabriel Rossetti taught art at the London Working Men's College, they challenged assumptions that aesthetic understanding was reserved for privileged classes. These educational experiments suggested that intellectual development was not determined by social origin, but represented universal human potential, requiring proper nurturing. The gradual inclusion of girls and women in educational expansion particularly demonstrated Victorian society's capacity for moral evolution despite entrenched resistance. Early Victorian ideology maintained that female education should focus exclusively on domestic accomplishments and moral cultivation, rather than intellectual development. Medical authorities claimed extensive mental activity would damage women's reproductive capabilities, while social commentators warned that educated women would neglect domestic responsibilities. Against these formidable barriers, pioneers like Emily Davies established women's colleges that demonstrated female students could excel in rigorous academic study without predicted physical or social catastrophes. Each cohort of successful female graduates challenged naturalized assumptions about gender capabilities, gradually shifting cultural narratives about women's intellectual potential. Adult education movements developed through mechanics institutes, literary societies, and university extension lectures created unprecedented opportunities for continuous learning across the lifespan. The establishment of free public libraries through the 1850 Public Libraries Act created spaces where working people could access knowledge resources previously available only to privileged. These various initiatives collectively transformed education from a fixed, early life experience to a potential lifelong pursuit, a conceptual shift with profound implications for human development and social mobility. Victorian social reforms face formidable resistance that illuminates the contested nature of moral progress. Factory owners vigorously opposed workplace regulations as violations of economic freedom and property rights, mobilizing parliamentary influence to delay or dilute protective legislation. Educational expansion encountered resistance from those who feared that excessive learning would make working-class people discontent with their assigned social positions. Women's suffrage faced particularly virulent opposition, with arguments ranging from women's supposed intellectual inferiority to warnings about the destruction of family structures. Colonial reform efforts revealed particularly stark limitations in Victorian moral imagination. Even dedicated domestic reformers often accepted imperial hierarchies that justified European domination of indigenous populations. Humanitarian concerns about slavery or exploitative labor practices in colonial territories frequently framed indigenous peoples as requiring European protection and guidance rather than self-determination. These contradictions remind us that moral evolution proceeds unevenly, with certain forms of compassion developing alongside persistent blindness to other injustices. Religious institutions demonstrated similar complexity, simultaneously supporting and resisting various reform efforts. Evangelical Christianity provided powerful moral frameworks and organizational networks for anti-slavery campaigns and child protection efforts. Yet religious authorities often oppose women's rights movements and scientific education as threatening divine hierarchies. This ambivalence reminds us that moral evolution rarely proceeds through absolute institutional positions, but through complex interactions between competing values and interests. Understanding these countervailing forces helps us recognize the genuine achievement represented by Victorian reforms. Progress occurred not through automatic enlightenment, but through persistent effort against powerful opposition. The gradual implementation of factory regulations, educational access, and emerging rights for women represented hard-won victories achieved through strategic advocacy, compelling evidence, and moral persuasion, not inevitable developments. This contested nature of moral progress provides crucial perspective for contemporary social movements facing their own formidable resistance. Victorian cultural expressions emerged as powerful forms of social commentary and resistance, creating spaces where conventional wisdom could be questioned and alternative visions articulated. Literature became a particularly potent vehicle for social critique, with Charles Dickens using his immense popular appeal to expose the human cost of industrialization and class inequality. Novels like Hard Times directly challenged utilitarian philosophies that reduced human experience to economic calculations, while Bleak House exposed the labyrinthine failures of legal systems that perpetuated injustice behind facades of procedural propriety. These works did more than entertain. They cultivated empathy across class boundaries and created moral pressure for reform. Visual arts similarly developed as sites of resistance to industrial uniformity and commercial values. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood explicitly positioned their artistic practice against what they perceived as the soulless conventions of academic painting and mass production aesthetics. Artists like William Holman Hunt, John Everett Millais, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti returned to meticulous craftsmanship, vivid colors, and complex symbolism as deliberate counterpoint to industrial standardization. Their work celebrated detailed observation of nature and emotional authenticity during an era increasingly dominated by mechanization and artificial environments. Women writers use creative expression to explore the limitations placed on female existence while simultaneously demonstrating intellectual capabilities society often denied them. Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh presented female protagonists with complex interior lives who demanded autonomy and intellectual fulfillment. Female novelists often explored domestic spaces not as trivial feminine domains, but as complex social worlds where larger power structures manifested in intimate relationships. Through these explorations, Women writers implicitly challenge Victorian gender ideologies while working within publication systems that often require them to adopt male pseudonyms or conform to certain narrative expectations. Working-class cultural expressions developed through music halls, broadside ballads, and popular entertainment that often subverted respectability politics with irreverent humor and celebration of ordinary experiences. These cultural forms created community spaces where the indignities of industrial labor could be momentarily forgotten and alternative values celebrated. While middle-class Victorians might dismiss such entertainment as vulgar, these expressions represented crucial sites of working-class identity formation and resistance to bourgeois cultural hegemony. The British Empire created unprecedented global networks that transformed communities across continents through complex patterns of exploitation, resistance, and cultural exchange. Telegraph lines physically connected distant territories, allowing information to travel at previously unimaginable speeds and creating new possibilities for coordinating global commerce and governance. These communication systems fundamentally altered how people conceived of time and space, compressing vast distances and creating new forms of simultaneity across the globe. The imperial postal system similarly connected millions of people through standardized practices that made regular correspondence possible across oceans. Imperial expansion catalyzed profound economic transformations that restructured global resource flows. Raw materials from colonized territory supplied British factories, while manufactured goods from Birmingham and Manchester found markets in Asia and Africa. These economic relationships created deeply unequal exchanges that facilitated industrial development in Britain, while often undermining indigenous manufacturing traditions elsewhere. Yet these networks also created opportunities for colonized peoples to access new technologies, adapt them to local conditions, and eventually use them to challenge imperial control. Cultural interactions across imperial spaces produced hybrid identities and practices that defied simple binaries between colonizer and colonized. Educational institutions established under colonial administration transmitted European knowledge systems, but simultaneously created spaces where indigenous intellectuals could master these systems and eventually critique imperial ideologies using the colonizer's own intellectual tools. Religious movements across the empire often blended Christian theological elements with local spiritual traditions, creating syncretic practices that neither missionary societies nor traditional religious authorities could fully control. Colonial cities became particularly important sites of cultural hybridity where architectural styles, culinary practices, linguistic expressions, and social customs blended in complex patterns. Places like Bombay, Mumbai, Cairo, and Singapore developed as cosmopolitan centers where diverse populations interacted daily, creating urban cultures that defied easy categorization. While colonial administrators often attempted to maintain racial and cultural segregation, the practical realities of urban life frequently undermined these efforts through countless daily interactions across supposed boundaries. These imperial networks established enduring patterns of global interconnection that would outlast formal imperial control. Transportation infrastructures built for extractive purposes continued facilitating human movement and commerce after independence. Administrative systems designed for imperial governance formed template for post-colonial state structures. Educational institutions established during colonial periods continued shaping knowledge production and professional formation long after empire's formal end. The Victorian era's most profound legacy lies not in its specific achievements, but in its demonstration of human transformative capacity on multiple scales. It revealed how rapidly established social orders could be reconfigured through technological innovation, intellectual reimagining, and collective action. The period showed that arrangements once considered natural and immutable, transportation limited by animal power, communication constrained by physical presence, social hierarchy determined by birth, could be fundamentally altered within a single generation. This recognition of transformative possibility continues informing social movements and reform efforts to the present day. Educational systems developed during this period established enduring institutional frameworks and pedagogical approaches. The gradual expansion of schooling beyond elite circles, while still profoundly limited by class and gender restrictions, established important precedents for public education. The Victorian emphasis on standardized curricula, age-graded classrooms, and credential-based advancement created educational structures that would become global templates in subsequent centuries. These systems embodied particular values about knowledge hierarchies and learning processes that continue influencing educational practices worldwide. Scientific methodologies refined during this era established procedural norms and evidentiary standards that transcended their original contexts. The emphasis on systematic observation, experimental verification, peer review, and public demonstration created research practices still recognizable in contemporary scientific institutions. These approaches represented more than technical procedures. They embodied epistemic values about transparency, reproducibility, and communal verification that continue shaping how knowledge claims achieve legitimacy across diverse fields. Urban planning concept developed in response to Victorian industrial challenges established enduring approaches to organizing built environments. The recognition that unregulated development created public health crises led to sanitation systems, building codes, and zoning practices that remain fundamental to contemporary urban governance. Public parks designed as lungs of the city reflected emerging understandings about environmental needs within industrial contexts, concerns that would eventually expand into modern environmental movements. Labor regulations emerging from Victorian struggles between workers and industrial capitalists established crucial precedents for workplace governance. Factory acts limiting working hours, restricting child labor, and mandating safety measures represented early recognition that markets alone could not ensure humane working conditions. These hard-won protections established the principle that economic relationships required social regulation, a concept that would expand into more comprehensive labor legislation and welfare systems in the 20th century. Global communication networks, initially established for imperial administration, created infrastructural foundations for subsequent forms of international connection. The standardization of postal services, development of telegraphy, and establishment of news agencies laid groundwork for increasingly dense information flows across national boundaries. These communication systems enabled new forms of transnational organization, from scientific collaboration to political movements, that would characterize modern global civil society. Perhaps most fundamentally, Victorian experiences with industrial transformation provide crucial historical perspective on contemporary technological disruptions. The period demonstrates both tremendous creative potential and profound social dislocations that accompany fundamental technological change. It reveals how existing institutions struggle to adapt to new technological realities, how vulnerable populations often bear disproportionate costs of transition, and how intentional social policies can mitigate these challenges. This historical understanding offers valuable context for navigating current technological transformations with greater awareness of their human implications. The Victorian period was not a concluded chapter, but an ongoing conversation. Its tensions, innovations, and challenging contradictions continue to resonate in our contemporary world. It reminds us that progress is not a destination, but a continuous, complex negotiation, a collective human endeavor of imagination, critique, and reconstruction. As we face our own contemporary challenges, technological disruptions, social inequalities, environmental transformations, The Victorian era offers profound lesson. It demonstrates humanity's remarkable capacity to look unflinchingly at existing systems, imagine alternative possibilities, and commit to transformative change. The Victorian period was not just a historical era, but a testament to human potential, a declaration that collective human imagination can reshape the very foundations of social experience.